Well, it's good to see all the cameras here. The reason why I'm here in Seattle is to engage in, what I would consider to be American democratic tradition of a town hall meeting, to put forward some ideas about a very critical situation that we as a people are facing in Iraq in regards to the potential of war with Iraq, how to deal with emerging threats from Iraq, and frankly speaking, what direction we as Americans are going to be taking in terms of interacting with the international community in decades to come. The purpose is to engender a dialogue, discussion, and a debate that appears to be sadly lacking at this point in time in our history, and I'll take any questions anybody has about the issue.
What difficulties do you see with the Americans going in with a new program?
New program of inspections? The problem is that the President of the United States, George W. Bush, had made it clear in his presentation to the United Nations, even before this most recent trip, that Iraq must be held fully accountable to the rule of law, and that the rule of law is set forth in existing Security Council resolutions. The President, in his presentation to the General Assembly, he made it clear that Iraq was not in compliance and that we must bring Iraq into compliance. And now we have a situation where Iraq has agreed to be held accountable to the rule of law as set forth in Security Council resolutions, to allow the return of inspectors, and that apparently isn't good enough for the President. He won't take yes for an answer. Now we have to pass a new law, and if you read this new law, it's not about facilitating the work of the inspectors, it's about creating conditions which are unacceptable to the Iraqi government, so that there will be a rejection of the return of inspectors, thereby clearing the way for war. So I got some significant issues with how the President's handling this one.
You were there. The main issue was some of the presidential palaces that can't be inspected. What's your feeling with what he hides there?
Actually, the main issue was Iraq's obligation to be disarmed. Presidential palaces never factored into this issue. The presidential palaces are a construct of the United States political dynamic, which seeks to use weapons inspections as a means to facilitate regime removal. Let's keep in mind that the foremost policy objective of the United States since 1991 in regards to Iraq has been the removal of Saddam Hussein from power, and that weapons inspections are only convenient to American policymakers insofar as they facilitated regime removal. Presidential palaces were an issue raised by the United States as a means of provoking confrontation. These are massive facilities, but they are residential in nature. Weapons inspectors never had any reason to go to presidential palaces. We had a right to go to presidential palaces. We have a right to go anywhere we wanted to in Iraq, as long as there was a valid disarmament reason to send us there. We talk about holding Iraq fully accountable to the rule of law, that Iraq has to facilitate the immediate unconditional access of inspectors to sites designated for inspection by the executive chairman of the inspectors. And yet no one talks about the requirement as set forth by the Security Council for inspectors to operate in full respect to the dignity, the sovereignty, and the national security of Iraq, meaning that we don't do things unless they fall under our mandate of disarmament. We went to presidential sites because the United States said this was an issue, that the Iraqis had to give us access to these sites. Kofi Annan traveled to Baghdad in February 1998 and orchestrated a compromise, the Memorandum of Understanding, which gained inspection access to these sites. The sites were inspected. I think Americans better start familiarizing themselves with a meeting that took place on June 14th, 1998, because it's very telling. This was the third plenary session between the weapons inspectors and the government of Iraq held in Baghdad. At this session, Tariq Aziz, the Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq, turned to Charles Dulfer, the American Deputy Executive Chairman, and said, "You just came back from Baghdad, Mr. Dulfer. 77 inspectors went through the presidential palaces. The world almost went to war because you said there were weapons hidden in the president's palace. What did you find, Mr. Dulfer? What did you find?" And Charles Dulfer looked at him and said, "We never expected to find any weapons in the presidential palaces. We went there to prove a point of access." My goodness, what does that say? It says that this thing is an artificial construct being manipulated by the United States to provoke confrontation with Iraq. It's not about disarming Iraq. And I think that's what the American public better understand in the upcoming debate about access to presidential sites. It has nothing to do with disarmament and everything to do with facilitating confrontation that will lead to a military action that, according to the United States, will lead to the removal of Saddam Hussein from power.
In all of your inspections, did you find anything?
In the entire time the weapons inspectors were in Iraq, there was only one occasion when we found weapons of mass destruction related material through the process of inspections. This was in June 1991 when nuclear inspection teams found illegal uranium enrichment equipment hidden on the back of trucks being shuttled out of facilities. From that moment on, we never found a single weapon. We never found a single piece of illegal production equipment, etc. And yet we disarmed Iraq. And the way we disarmed Iraq was the same way that police extract confessions from criminals. We talked to the Iraqis. We did investigations. We confronted them with inconsistencies in their stories. And in the end, the Iraqis confessed to having material, and then they would lead us to the material, and then we would take it and dispose of it. That was the process of disarmament. And yes, the Iraqis led us to an awful lot of illegal material pertaining to their weapons programs. But did we find it? No.
How likely would it be to, if there is a team that goes in, how likely will they find something? What's the likeliness of that even occurring? It seems like they've had a lot of time to hide or dispose of, or.
Again, the team that will go into Iraq will bring to bear the same forensic investigative techniques that the previous team had, which means that while we may not open a door and find a weapon hidden in a basement room, we will compel the Iraqis to confess their sins, confess their crimes, if in fact a crime has been committed. We will find evidence of prohibited activity, if in fact activity of a prohibitive nature has taken place. That's how the inspections work. They worked in the past, and they can work again in the future, if given a chance. We achieved a 95% level of disarmament of Iraq from 1991 to 1996. This means 100% of the facilities used by Iraq to produce weapons of mass destruction were destroyed, together with their associated production equipment. And the vast majority of the product produced by these factories were likewise accounted for. That's a good result. Inspections do work. So yes, if inspectors get in, I believe that if Iraq has done something of an illegal nature in terms of production of weapons of mass destruction, they will find the evidence and compel the Iraqis to confess. Likewise, if Iraq hasn't done anything, the inspectors will be able to determine that nothing of an illegal nature has taken place, and they can find Iraq to be in compliance. That's the purpose of the inspection regime.
I mean, you guys confessing, I mean, doesn't seem like they would want to confess to anything that they haven't. It seems like they would want to hide it and keep it hidden. And
most murderers don't like to confess to the fact that they murdered somebody and buried a body. But at the end of the day, when subjected to, hard-nosed police investigatory tactics, they confess. The Iraqis, if they did something illegal, won't want to confess, but they'll be compelled to when they're exposed to the overwhelming body of evidence that the inspectors are capable of collecting. This is nothing more than police work. Let the inspectors go in and carry out the police work. Hold Iraq fully accountable to the rule of law. But it's also imperative that the inspectors themselves be held accountable to the rule of law in the same way that we demand our police departments when prosecuting or carrying out an investigation of a suspected criminal. What happens when a cop plants evidence? What happens when a cop does an illegal search and seizure or does an illegal wiretap? The case is dropped. It doesn't mean the criminal didn't commit a crime. It means that because the prosecution lost the integrity of the process of the investigation, the criminal goes free. This is what's happened to Iraq in the past decade. The investigation lost its integrity. The United States manipulated the process of inspections to gather intelligence information that pertained not to the disarmament of Iraq, but the security of Saddam Hussein, and that's why the inspectors aren't in Iraq today. Now we have an opportunity to get them back in, to hold Saddam Hussein, a criminal, fully accountable to the rule of law. But it's imperative that we do not allow the United States of America to once again manipulate the inspection process for purposes other than that set forth by the Security Council. Sir.
Mr. Ritter, Jerry Kahn on KBCS Community Radio. Today, in his weekly radio address to the nation, President Bush acknowledged that the American people are peace-loving, and he promised that he would take us to war only as a last resort. At the same time, he said that war might be unavoidable if Saddam Hussein does not disarm. If indeed there is no hard proof that Iraq possesses significant weapons of mass destruction and no proof of ties to terrorist organizations, then why do you think the administration seems so determined to go to war?
Well, I think you rightly point out that there has been no substantive fact put forward by the administration or any of our allies to back up the allegations that Iraq retains weapons of mass destruction capability. I share the concern of the Bush administration about the potential for Iraq to have these weapons. That's why I have been a fervent supporter of the return of viable weapons inspectors to Iraq, weapons inspectors who are capable of disarming Iraq. The Bush administration speaks of a grave and emerging threat from Iraq in terms of their weapons of mass destruction, and this is justification for America to go to war. And yet, we have the opportunity now to return inspectors to Iraq to carry out this investigation, to find out if indeed Iraq has these weapons, and the Bush administration is shutting the door on the return of these inspectors, creating preconditions for the return of inspectors that are so outlandish that it's a guarantee that Iraq will reject. And if Iraq rejects, then war, as President Bush says, is inevitable. The Bush administration wants war, and the reason is simple. It's about removing Saddam Hussein from power. It's about implementing the new doctrine of the United States as set forth in the National Security Strategy document published 2 weeks ago of American unilateralism, where the United States will take advantage of its overwhelming superiority in terms of military strength, economic strength, and diplomatic strength to ensure that no parity exists in the world, that we maintain our dominance, and we will do this through preemptive action if necessary. They call it unilateralism. I think another term for it is imperialism. And this is what President Bush is seeking to do by going to war with Iraq. Iraq is the first case study of the implementation of the new doctrine of American unilateralism, and if allowed to occur unchallenged by the American people, it will define the United States in decades to come as an imperial power. And I tend to keep in mind that we actually fought a revolution to free ourselves from an imperial power, and now we're becoming one. This is why I'm here speaking out today. It's time the American public wake up that something's happening in their name that may not reflect the values that we aspire to, especially the values set forth in the Constitution of the United States of America.
How do you interpret Hans Blix's appearance yesterday with Secretary of State Colin Powell and his announcement that he's going to delay the return of the inspectors to Iraq?
I think that speaks volumes as to the amount of power the United States has, the ability of the United States to unilaterally dictate to an independent organ of the Security Council what measures will be taken in the name of the Security Council. If Hans Blix was brave, Hans Blix would stand up and say, the Security Council has passed resolutions calling for the disarmament of Iraq. These resolutions are still in effect. Iraq has agreed to be held accountable to the law as set forth in these resolutions. Therefore, we must go forward and implement these resolutions and force the United States to expose itself by stopping the return of inspectors. But by being complicit with Colin Powell in the manner that he did, Hans Blix is facilitating not the return of inspectors, but the initiation of military action. And I condemn him in the strongest possible terms.
From your experience standpoint, what should be done? You have a resolution from the United Nations, a mandate to do inspections. How do you feel safely they can be conducted to solve the problem?
It's not my position to prejudge an outcome. The Security Council has passed a law. The law says Iraq must disarm. The law is passed under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter that says if Iraq does not comply, then there will be enforcement. And it's up to the Security Council to determine the nature of that enforcement. But that enforcement can include military action. Rather than prejudge the outcome, however, we should send the inspectors back in and find out what the outcome will be. I think the international community is united in stating that Iraq will not have any second chances. They've outlived their 9 lives. And if Iraq chooses to resume its past practices of obstructionism, cheating, lying, concealing, then Iraq must understand that it will be held fully accountable. And this could include military action that could lead to Saddam Hussein and the government of Iraq being removed from power. That is a real possibility that has to be considered. But understand what I just said, that this military action would be derived from Security Council agreement that Iraq was no longer in compliance, not unilateral dictate from the United States of America. There may be justification for war. There isn't yet. So the solution is to send inspectors back in. Now, I think we have to recognize the reality of the political dynamic here in the United States, where the President and the administration of President Bush have committed an overwhelming amount of political capital behind the concept of regime removal. I think we also have to recognize that Saddam Hussein is a brutal, tyrannical dictator who has carried out crimes against humanity. The President stood before the United Nations and said that we must hold Saddam Hussein accountable to the law. I would suggest then, Mr. President, that you seek an indictment against Saddam Hussein and his leadership for crimes against humanity. I would also recommend that because we now are compelling Iraq into compliance with its obligation to disarm by use of military force, that there is no longer a need to maintain economic sanctions against Iraq linked to its disarmament obligation. So lift the sanctions, Mr. President. Lift the sanctions against Iraq. And then after you get your indictment, reimpose the sanctions and tell the Iraqi people sanctions will be lifted when you turn the criminal Saddam Hussein over to the International Court of Justice. And in doing so, you guarantee Saddam Hussein will be removed from power within 6 months. That's how I would handle this problem.
This raises a question about the International Court of Justice, which the Bush administration refuses to join. And if you wish to bring charges of crimes against humanity, should there not be a place in the dock for Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, who were aiding and abetting Saddam Hussein in the 80s in his buildup of weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons particularly? Donald Rumsfeld went as Ronald Reagan's envoy in the mid-80s to pave the way to the restoration of diplomatic relations with Iraq when the UN was reporting and the U.S. State Department was confirming that Iraq was using poison gas on the battlefield against the Iranians. So he cannot claim ignorance, although he does now. If there are to be criminal charges, these two members of the previous administration are definitely part and parcel of the problem.
Well, I agree that this solution of the rule of law confronts the Bush administration with the harsh reality that they have rejected the rule of law, that they have embraced the concept of American unilateralism. You asked for a solution, though, and I believe that the solution comes down to any solution that we seek in regards to Iraq has to be derived from our very foundation as American citizens, the Constitution of the United States of America, which states clearly that we are a nation of laws, that we will abide by the rule of law, and that as a nation of laws, we will, and we recognize in the Constitution that when we as a nation sign international agreements, treaties, that these treaties and agreements carry the force of law here in America. We are signatories to the United Nations Charter. We therefore are held accountable to the rule of law as set forth in that charter. So any solution we want to seek in regards to Iraq must conform to the United Nations Charter. Regime removal is specifically prohibited by the United Nations Charter. So, we have some very fundamental issues here that have to be addressed. If President Bush wants a solution to go through the International Court of Justice, then he needs to walk away from the concept of American unilateralism, American imperialism, and talk about re-embracing the concept of multilateralism, where America is a member of a global community that adheres to the same standards, the same laws. I'm not going to sit here and say whether or not a case exists against anybody in the Bush administration or previous administrations. That's something that if people feel strongly about should bring up to a International Court of Justice or any other international legal body and make that case. And if a case exists, then charges will be brought to bear. But we're talking about Iraq here. We're talking about Saddam Hussein. And I am looking for a solution short of war to resolve this problem. And to me, if the president is wrapped around the issue of regime removal and believes that this cannot be solved until which time Saddam Hussein is removed from power, there is a non-military way to achieve this, and that is indict him as a war criminal. And believe me, the Russians, French, and Chinese would support such an indictment today to avoid a war. We have all the leverage we need right now to push an indictment through. We could get an indictment, we could charge Saddam Hussein, and then we could link the lifting of economic sanctions to the Iraqi people turning over Saddam Hussein and the indicted war criminals for justice, the same way that we linked sanctions on Yugoslavia with the Yugoslavian people turning Milosevic over to the International Court of Justice. Yes, ma'am.
Following on that idea, is there reason to think that following your scenario, the Iraqi people would be any more able to capture, turn over, overthrow Saddam Hussein than they would without an indictment in the international court?
I'm not asking the Iraqi people to overthrow Saddam Hussein.
Turn
I'll
over
be
the
very,
court, you said.
I'm not asking the Iraqi people to turn him over the court. You notice what I said. You indict Saddam Hussein and his senior leadership. The Ba'ath Party stays in power. The tribal structure stays in power. Saddam Hussein's tribal family that dominates Iraq stays in power. This indictment does not threaten the existing power structure in Iraq. It's not the Iraqi people that are going to turn Saddam Hussein over. It's the power structure that will be destroyed if we go to war that will turn him over. By isolating Saddam Hussein within his own power structure, that's how you get rid of him.
Do you think that's possible?
I know it's possible. The tribe does not want to lose power. And once the tribe has been singled out with the potential of destruction, they will turn over Saddam Hussein to stay in power. And then once you lift economic sanctions, you empower 54% of the middle class population of Iraqi urban areas, which are middle class, to start the revolution from within that will cause this Ba'athist Party hierarchy to gradually dissolve over the course of 10 to 20 years so that you can have something that resembles democracy in Iraq. And the beauty of it is that's an Iraqi solution, not one imposed on Iraq by other nations.
In Washington, weapons of mass destruction has been one of the primary motivators towards U.S. action in Iraq. Which methodology has destroyed more weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? The UN inspections or the U.S. aerial bombings of Desert Storm and Desert Fox?
Well, it's not even close. UN weapons inspections destroyed on several orders of magnitude more weapons of mass destruction capability than the combined effects of American military action in Desert Storm and Desert Fox.
So if we were just looking at trying to destroy their weapons of mass destruction, that would be the best methodology then for going into doing.
Well, it's not just the most effective, it's the only one that's legal under international law. So it's the one that the international community has said they will endorse in terms of dealing with the problem of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction.
Can you give us some more examples of the struggles that UN inspectors had to deal with from the U.S. standpoint? What roadblocks the U.S. put in there?
Well, the dominant one, of course, is the issue of regime removal. Regime removal is a poison pill to the concept of weapons inspections. Weapons inspections speak of a process of disarmament, at the end of which, when if Iraq is found to be in compliance, leads to the lifting of economic sanctions that were linked to Iraq's obligation to disarm. So the way the process works is inspectors go in, disarm Iraq, make a finding of compliance, sanctions are lifted. The whole purpose of linking sanctions to disarmament issues is to contain Saddam Hussein, not allow him to break out until he has disarmed. So if you lift sanctions, you've broken containment, which means Iraq comes back into the fold of the international community in full control of its own economy with Saddam Hussein at the helm. But if your policy is regime removal, you can't have that because you want Saddam Hussein gone. So regime removal states that sanctions will never be lifted, that weapons inspections will only be useful insofar as they promote the continuation of economic sanctions, that the second weapons inspections threaten sanctions through a finding of compliance, you have a fundamental issue. So the United States has always been in a position to threaten the viability of the weapons inspection process. And this is what happened in 1998, when the United States manipulated the inspection process to deliberately provoke a confrontation, then withdrew inspectors on their own orders. The Iraqis did not kick the inspectors out, and then bombed Iraq, bombed security installations in Saddam Hussein's palaces using intelligence information gathered by the inspectors. Iraq basically said inspectors aren't welcome back in. The United States succeeded. They tried to kill Saddam, that didn't work, but they did kill the weapons inspection process, which means sanctions are in place, containment is maintained, and now there's no vehicle to threaten this. Because without inspectors, there can be no finding of compliance. Without a finding of compliance, you can't lift economic sanctions. Therefore, Saddam Hussein is contained indefinitely until which time a solution is found to the issue of regime removal. Yes, sir.
Like our Seattle representative, Jim McDermott, you had to go to Baghdad before the media started covering what you had to say. Now you've been criticized for visiting Iraq and I would say mercilessly attacked by some in the government and the media. Are you concerned that we are becoming less tolerant of dissenting opinions in this country?
Yes. Let's put it this way. You know, we talk about American democracy. I talk about American democracy. I love American democracy. I believe in the Constitution. I took an oath as an officer of Marines to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I know what it means to be willing to give your life to die for that piece of paper. It speaks of democracy. It speaks of freedom of speech, civil rights, civil liberties, and it talks about a process of dialogue and discussion. At the local level, in local politics, American democracy flourishes. We have you can pick any situation you want, whether where I come from in Albany, New York, it's the dredging of the Hudson River was a big issue. And you saw the population of Albany and upstate New York rise up and become involved in a debate about do we dredge or don't we dredge to get rid of PCBs dumped by General Electric. At the end of the day, one side wins. But do you see the media going after those who oppose dredging, calling them traitors, calling them unpatriotic? No. The American democratic process isn't that way. They fought the fight. Democracy won. The team with the most votes emerged victorious, and the others accepted. But there is no character assassination calling one side unpatriotic or treasonous. But when we jump forward to the national level, into presidential politics, the rules change suddenly. We're not allowed, especially since September 11th, we're not allowed to ask questions. We're not allowed to, put out a dissenting voice. To do so is characterized as treasonous. Here we are in a situation where we might be going to war. I went to Baghdad to prevail upon the Iraqi government to allow the return of inspectors. 5 days after I left Baghdad, the Iraqi government said, we're going to let inspectors in. Whether or not I had any role in that, I don't know. But all I can say is, I believe I played a significant part in a process that opened the door for a peaceful resolution to a situation that has been identified as by the President of the United States as the reason to go to war, i.e. weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We now have the ability to get inspectors back in and solve that. And I'm called treasonous for doing this? Absurd. Opening a door to a peaceful resolution to a problem that, if resolved through military action, could lead to the deaths of thousands of Americans, tens of thousands of Iraqis, and I'm treasonous? I think not. It's a tragic commentary on the state of American democracy, that not only can the presidency, the Bush administration and its supporters get away with making this charge, but that no one in the American public is standing up and condemning them for making that charge. And it's not just me. Representative Jim, your representative went to Baghdad. He spoke out bravely. You can disagree with him. People can say, we don't agree with your assessments. But he should never be condemned for doing what he did. He should be embraced for doing what he did. Because what he did was to inject a dissenting voice into a debate that is non-existent. What he did was to try to jumpstart American democracy, which has fallen into a coma as of late. No, Jim McDermott's a hero, not a traitor. He should be treated as such, even if you don't agree with what he's saying.